The day my family gathered to argue over my grandfather's life like scavengers around a fresh kill is the day I learned how loud people can be when they pretend to be sad. I remember the courtroom like a stage, their voices ricocheting off the wood, their lacquered faces soft at the edges with fake grief, then sharpening into something cold and clear when the lawyer spoke about money. I sat quiet, palms flat against the chair, listening to my aunt claim I had manipulated an old man into writing me everything. They called me names I had heard my whole life. They didn't see the way my hands shook or the way my grandfather's last look still lived behind my eyes. I will not tell you now how that meeting ended. I will only say this. He knew what he was doing and he smiled in the rain the night before he died, like a man who had finally tied a knot too tight to undo. "Don't worry," he said into my wet shirt, pressing his forehead to mine. "I know who's who." Back then, the world was smaller and kinder when it came to us too. My grandfather ran a tugboat and a clock shop, which sounds odd together, but nothing about him liked being ordinary. He had hands like old leather and eyes that missed nothing. When I was a kid, I believed the clocks in his shop ran on truth. He taught me to oil gears, to hear the heartbeat under brass, to read the time on a face before I could read a book. He also taught me how to read people. "Look at their hands," he'd say, tipping a battered pocket watch toward me. "Greed leaves a mark on the skin, it stiffens the fingers." He would laugh, a low sound, and ruffle my hair like I was still 7. "Don't worry, I know who's who," he would say, and then wink like the secret was ours alone. My family treated me like a weathered coat they hung in some back closet and forgot about until someone needed a place to put their hands. My cousins, in their polished suits in suburban houses, would hover in the corners at dinners while my uncles debated estate plans like they were solving a crossword. They called me everything from quirk to driftwood. The words didn't hurt as much as the lack of eye contact, the way they never bothered to learn my job, my friends, my small wins. I was the one who fixed things no one else wanted to touch. I was content to be the man who could mend a clock and mend a leaking roof and tell a story that made my grandfather laugh until his throat hurt. That was enough for me, for him too. "Don't worry, I know who's who," he'd say when someone tried to make me feel small. He would put his palm on my cheek and his hand smelled of oil and lemon oil, the scent of a man who spent his life polishing both brass and truth. People thought he was simple. They called him old-fashioned, sentimental. They didn't understand the chess game he played with every coffee he poured, with every question he asked about their lives. He never missed a pattern. He watched how my aunt's smile softened when talk turned to money, the way my cousin's laughter paused when someone mentioned the warehouse in town. He collected more than clocks. He kept ledgers, receipts, small maps, and a stack of grudges that read like his own history. He taught me to keep a small notebook to write down names and times and promises. "Paper remembers the truth better than people do," he told me. One night he gave me a sealed envelope and said, "Don't open it now. When the time comes, you'll need this." I put it in my drawer like a talisman, not daring to peek even when curiosity burned me. "Don't worry," he said, tapping my knuckles, "I know who's who." When his health started to fold like cheap paper, the family calendar shifted. Suddenly there were more visits, more casseroles, more people who remembered him only in the context of heirlooms. I watched them parade through his house, hands grazing the mantel, eyes on the paintings and the safe in the study. They brought sympathy that smelled faintly of commerce, and I kept my mouth shut because the last thing he needed was my bad blood complicating his last days. We read together, or he read, and I listened. He would tell me about the sea and the clocks and how both had a rhythm you could trust if you learned to watch it long enough. "Promise me you'll listen to the quiet," he said once, staring at the ticking wall. I promised. "Don't worry, I know who's who." He said it like a benediction more than a warning. On the day he left, the room felt too large for all the breathing. He squeezed my hand with a strength that surprised me and smiled with a face I loved so much it hurt. He told me to keep the little things, the pocket watch he had given me when I was 13, the leather notebook with my name in the corner, and the key that opened a drawer in his desk. He did not make speeches. He did not gather us all and declare his heart. He simply closed his eyes and the clock on the mantel went on ticking like it didn't care about endings. At the wake, the vultures circled quicker than crows at a barn door. Perfume and plastic smiles replaced the quiet he and I had shared. As people whispered about balances and documents, I felt the promise he had made to me hum under my skin like a distant engine. "Don't worry," I found myself whispering into my own palm when I sat alone by the urn, "I know who's who." The room smelled like old wood and cheap coffee, as if the house itself had been rehearsing for this moment for years. I sat on the edge of a couch that had a seam exactly where my grandfather used to rest his knee, and around me, the family looked like they had been painted into place. My aunt wore the same set of pearls she saved for funerals and estate hearings. My cousin had a face that had been folded into polite shock so many times it could not hide the hunger beneath. And my uncle kept his hands jammed into his pockets like he was trying to hide the way his fingers were itching to count things. The lawyer cleared his throat in that small, clinical way lawyers have, the kind of sound that lowers a room and asks it to become blind and patient. I watched his lips move as if reading a script I had no lines for. My grandfather's clock above the mantel tapped the seconds like a man with something important to say, and I could feel the tiny notebook in my jacket press against my ribs like a secret I had promised to keep. I thought of his dry laugh and the way he said, "Don't worry, I know who's who," and the phrase sounded like a latch closing somewhere behind my heart. When the lawyer said my name, it landed in the room like a hammer. To his grandson, all personal property, the house, the workshop, the accounts, and the trustee is to distribute the remainder as he sees fit. The sentence did not feel finished. I felt a hum under my skin, a bright, stupid pulse of disbelief. I looked up and saw my aunt's face move through the stages of injury like a slow film, first stunned, then rigid, then enraged. My cousin's jaw worked as if he were trying to chew the sentence down into something he could swallow. Conversations started in whispers like rain at first, then they pooled into low, urgent currents. People who had claimed to love my grandfather opened their mouths and the words that came out did not mention memory or grief. They mentioned lawyers, accountants, warehouse titles, and fair shares, as if fairness was a thing you could staple to paper and put into an envelope. I heard the word contest whispered like a spell. Their eyes found me like they always did, an old habit, the same looks I had been collecting since childhood, a mix of pity and suspicion. Who helped him with this? Someone demanded before they even knew the question they were asking. How did he come to this decision? They looked at me as if I had moved the hands on the clock myself, as if I had rehearsed this betrayal. I wanted to tell them that he had made me a pocket watch when I was a boy and told me to keep time with care, that he had given me a key to a drawer and a piece of paper I had never opened, that he had put a kind of trust in me that felt like the last honest thing he had left. But the air was hot with accusation, and their mouths were already sharper than the truth. My chest tightened, and the notebook in my jacket felt like a small engine beating insistently. The plotting began so quickly it could have been a practice dance. My cousin's husband, who spent his days managing properties and loved ledgers more than people, pulled his sister aside and started muttering. They formed a tight little island of businesslike faces, and their whispers were the first concrete thing in the room I could see. Papers were made relevant. A phone was pulled out and a name was dialed with fingers that did not tremble. "We can contest this," my aunt said, her voice cold and very efficient as she began to lay out the steps like someone calling an elevator. "Undue influence, incapacity, we'll need medical records, witnesses, a handwriting expert, pool funds, hire Morgan, Morgan does wills." Hearing their strategy named so smooth and bureaucratic made my stomach drop like a stone. I had never expected a theater of grief to have box office plans ready at hand. I felt oddly exiled in my own family, like a man watching his reflection in a window that people used to recognize as him but now did not. They spoke of me in half-sentences that landed in my lap like insults. "He was always the odd one," my uncle said, loud enough for me to hear, as if oddness could be papered over into fraud. "Too close to the old man," another whispered, the undertones saying the thing they all thought, that my closeness was a kind of theft. I wanted to shout that closeness was the only honest currency between me and the grandfather who taught me to mend clocks, and to notice the way greed made fingers stiff. But anger would have changed nothing and would have looked exactly like the performance they expected of me. Instead, I watched them gather, watched them put together the means to attack what they labeled as a problem, me. Their eyes darted toward the study like vultures circling the safe. They had already chosen their prey before the day was done. Even in the push of betrayal, something in me kept small and stubborn, my grandfather's smile, the memory of him tapping the crown of my head and saying, "Don't worry, I know who's who." I thought about the sealed envelope he had pressed into my hands months ago, the one I had sworn not to open. For a ridiculous half-second, a childish hope rose that it was a treasure map or a last joke. I tucked that hope back into the pocket of my coat. Around me, people began to strategize like generals whose army was made of lawyers and money. They spoke of contesting the will with a casual cruelty, as if contesting a love could be done by form letters and expert testimony. I felt very small in that room of big plans, and yet I knew something else I couldn't name. A man who had worked a lifetime like a clockmaker does, planning for gears to move when hands touch them, had set things in motion long before the first accusation was even breathed. The whispering grew louder, but somewhere beneath the noise the clock kept going, and the sense of being seen by my grandfather stayed with me like a warm, stubborn ember. They didn't send a threat, they sent a ritual. A thick manila envelope slid through my door with a rubber stamp that smelled like someone else's business, and inside was paper that sang the word complaint like a bell. It was formal, clinical, and wrapped in the polite cruelty of the legal world, names, dates, accusations, and a signature that felt like a slap. They had filed suit. My family, my aunts that polished their opinions like silver, my uncles who measured life in square footage and ledgers, my cousins who wore their entitlement like cologne, had put their names on a piece of paper and declared war. The complaint read like someone had rewritten my life to suit their angle. Undue influence, lack of capacity, forgery, isolation, manipulation. They painted me as a schemer who had lived rent-free in my grandfather's goodwill and stolen the keys to his judgment. They called my closeness coercion and my silence conspiracy. The words were expertly chosen not to seek truth but to cut, to make neighbors and banks and the small-town barista raise an eyebrow and a whisper. The first thing they attacked was history. They dredged up old photographs and half-truths and the small skeletons I had kept in closets because they mattered less than kindness. A petty theft from my 20s, a run-in with police when I cared too much about someone else's pain and got in the wrong driveway. These were retold like character flaws and framed as evidence I was capable of manipulating a dying man. They claimed I had moved in to isolate him, that I controlled the caregivers, that I had been present at inconveniently precise times when the old man signed papers. They produced a witness. They found who remembered seeing me disappear with the grandfather into the study, as if closeness alone proves collusion. Someone even put a doctored photograph online that made it look like my grandfather was asleep with a hand over his mouth and me at his bedside with money in my coat. The picture sat on people's feeds, and their fingers flew with judgment before anyone had checked the facts. Beyond the legal words, the family wanted spectacle. My aunt called a cousin who wrote for the local paper and fed them a slow trickle of innuendo that made its way into headlines designed to fold my name into gossip. A private investigator, hired with pooled funds, showed up at the shop, my grandfather's old clock repair stall, asking rude, prepared questions about my hours and finances. Someone sent anonymous letters to longtime customers that hinted at something unsavory in the estate. It wasn't enough to bring me into court. They wanted to drag me through community opinion to make my face synonymous with theft and betrayal. The law had become a theater and they were auditioning for roles as the injured, wronged family. When the suit landed on my kitchen table, I felt the town tilt, like walking down a street that suddenly had eyes on every stoop. What cut me most was not the allegations themselves, but the voice behind them. The same people who had treated me like a peripheral story in family holiday chapters now hurled venom, as if my very existence undermined their right to breathe. They told anyone who would listen that my grandfather's last months were clouded by dementia, that he had been unfit to sign anything of importance. Never mind that his mind had the sharpness of a clock fan in certain rooms and a lazy fog in others. They claimed I had moved money, a phrase so vague it could mean anything. I was accused of buying favors, of bribing a nurse who had once asked for extra pillows and suddenly became a key player in their narrative. Every lie was a small hammer hitting the same stubborn place. Who I had always been to them, the thoughtless odd man out now made monstrous. I called everyone I could think of. I called the tugboat men who still spoke about my grandfather with a reverence that made their voices rough. I called the old woman who came by every Thursday for watch, batteries, and tea, and asked her to tell anyone who would listen that my grandfather had been lucid when he set the dates and that he had been pleased with his decision. People who had known him for decades answered in gentle, fierce tones that felt like armor. My new lawyer, the woman I found after their Morgan was named in hushed tones as the bulldog, was young and sharp and smelled of coffee and clean outrage. She told me to treat the notice as what it was, the opening salvo. They want to make you bleed in public, she said. Let them show themselves for what they are. Meanwhile, the sealed envelope my grandfather had pressed into my hands months before remained unread in my bedside drawer. I folded the legal papers around it like a promise. The envelope was a thing between me and him, a private engine wound tight with whatever plans he had made. For now, I would not break that engine. For now, I would let them make their noise and watch how quickly the vultures got tangled in each other's wings. The war had been declared, and I felt the old man's steady words in my head like an order. Don't worry, I know who's who. The lawyer's office smelled like ink and resolve, the kind of place where people swear promises and staples hold grudges together. She sat across from me behind a neat stack of files, eyes bright and sharp under a fringe of hair that never stayed quite neat, and when she opened the will, the room seemed to tilt on its axis. For a while, we just listened to the city outside, cars that sounded like foreign clocks and a dog barking somewhere like a metronome gone wrong, while she flipped pages and watched my face for the kind of reaction clients make when the world hands them either a gift or a grenade. I felt like a kid hiding in a library when the librarian said nothing, balancing the shame and the small joy of keeping a secret with a man who had spent his life building things that survived storms. She folded the paper back into place and smiled, not cruelly, but with the kind of calm that means lawyering is a craft where patience is sharper than a blade. There's a clause, she said, tapping the page where the ink had been burned into permanence, and her finger did not wobble even when the sentence read like a trap wrapped in respectability. It was written in old man English with contemporary force. Any beneficiary who directly or indirectly contests the will, files suit, funds litigation on behalf of a contest, or publicly accuses the settlor of undue influence or incapacity within 24 months shall forfeit all rights and entitlements under this instrument, and the property so forfeited shall be distributed to the Riverkeepers Collective and the Maritime Workers Trust in equal parts. It went on to specify that publicly accuses included social media posts, letters to editors, or statements communicated to third parties with intent to cause reputational harm. There was a notary, 2 witnesses, and a sentence near the end that made me smile in a way that felt like swallowing salt. Settlor anticipated such contests and crafted this clause to preserve intent and punish perfidy. My heart did a strange, small dance, part triumph and part a child's terror that a secret plan had actually worked. The Riverkeepers Collective was a scrappy anti-development group that had shut down my cousin's pet plan for riverfront condos years ago, and the Maritime Workers Trust was an old union my grandfather had once marched with when he was young and angry and impossibly brave. My relatives had spent the last decade sneering at those causes. They had called them nuisances, socialists, troublemakers. My aunt once joked at a dinner party that the Riverkeepers were charity for people who hate success. If the clause was real, then anyone who touched the will with the intent to take it would be the very agent of giving the money to the things they secretly loathed. My grandfather had not only protected me, he had pointed the sharpest edge of his last will at the vanity of his own family. My lawyer leaned back and let me take that in. It's a no-contest clause, she said, but it's more than a no-contest clause. Your grandfather wrote it so specifically it robs them of their most plausible arguments and turns public bluster into a forfeiture. It's the sort of thing judges respect if it's well executed, and this one is. He anticipated that they would hate these organizations, and he used that hatred as a deterrent. He made their noses lead them into the trap. She folded her hands and her voice went a little softer, like a person who knows how much people need to feel like they are not alone in battle. You do nothing, don't talk to them, don't comment on social media. Let them spend their money and their temper. If they file, the clause will be the centerpiece of our defense. If they back down, we keep everything. Either way, they look absurd. But the calm her words offered had edges. She told me the clause was strong but not invincible. There are ways to challenge intent or claim undue pressure at the moment of signing, and the family could try to argue that a punitive forfeiture for contesting is against public policy. They might bring in old medical records or surprise witnesses. They could try to attack the notary or the authentication. She listed the ways people with money and spite can gnaw through stone, but each strategy she named felt like a log on a fire my grandfather had already banked. Let them dig their own grave, she said, and the sentence landed like a verdict more than advice. She also handed me a list of immediate, boring instructions that felt like armor. Do not post, block unknown callers, make no public statements, preserve all communications, and most boring of all, do not open the old envelope your grandfather gave you until I tell you it's safe. That last rule felt like the one I would break first. The envelope had been a private weather in my life for months, a thing I slept beside every night like a talisman. The lawyer's eyes flicked to it when I mentioned it, and she seemed to understand without asking that my grandfather had created not only a legal mechanism but a story I was party to. She said the envelope could contain a letter detailing the reasoning or instructions or some personal bequest outside the will, or it could be nothing. That I didn't know felt both intolerable and exquisite. For once in my life I could be quiet and it would be the right thing. My grandfather knew how I loved noise and he built me a quiet to keep. On the walk home, the city felt like a place that had been rearranged to watch me. People looked the same, but the air seemed expectant, like tide waiting to turn. I imagined my aunt in an office with papers spread like wings as she called Morgan the bulldog and began to assemble a team. I imagined the Riverkeepers raising their fists and the Maritime Trust drafting checks. The indignation of my cousins fermenting into strategy that would only cost them everything he had decided they didn't deserve. I kept thinking of his hands, the softness of his laugh, the way he tapped my forehead and said, "Don't worry, I know who's who." The law might be complicated and the human heart messier still, but for the first time since I was a child I felt a kind of righteous patience settle over me. The storm would come, but for now there was calm. I had been told to wait, to watch, and to trust the man who had taught me to wind gears so carefully that they could turn a family inside out and leave only truth on the table. They thought silence would make me crumble. They thought that if they screamed loud enough and painted me black on every porch and feed, the town would turn and I would be left standing in the rain with nothing but the watch my grandfather gave me and the echo of his voice. For weeks their strategy was a steady, ugly drumbeat. I woke to messages that started as polite questions and turned into venom, to envelopes filled with photocopies of old receipts they twisted into evidence, to strangers at my workshop asking questions they pretended were casual. Someone hung a sign outside the shop that read in neat, accusatory letters, "Closed until further notice." A man I had once fixed a clock for told me he had been advised to stop bringing work to me. It hurt that even neutral hands pulled away like embers being fanned by the wind. They used every lever they could find. My aunt sent letters to old friends and former neighbors with a practiced tone of wounded dignity. My cousins filled social media with insinuations and doctored photos, clipping faces and rearranging context until it looked like a mosaic of guilt. Their lawyer, Morgan, made the sort of public remarks designed to sound measured while actually dangling the idea of fraud in front of judge and jury like a prize fly. A private investigator showed up twice at my door with a camera and the kind of blank patience that meant he was paid to be cruel. Someone stole a box of my grandfather's small brass gears from the shop and left a note that said, "Get what's yours." Every scrape and whisper felt engineered to push me into anger, because anger would be evidence and evidence was a currency they were desperate to mint. I tried to remember what my grandfather taught me about hands and about watching for the small motions people make when they mean to take. "Greed leaves a mark," he said, and I watched those marks grow like ink on paper. Yet I did what the lawyer told me and my gut told me do nothing. I did not call them liars in public. I did not call the papers. I kept my mouth shut and my shop open. I let the clocks tick their honest rhythm as if no storm had gathered outside the window. Inside me, the quiet was a furnace. I paced it, read old letters of his, and let the weeks stretch like cords I was steadily coiling. People who mattered came by quietly. The tugboat guys dropped off a basket of food and stayed to tell stories about my grandfather that were full of salty truth. The riverkeepers called once to say, in the kindest voice, that they had noticed something odd on the riverbank and would keep an eye out. The Maritime Trust left a cardboard box of old Union badges with a note that said, "In case you need to remind them who your grandfather was." Meanwhile, their confidence took on shape. There were meetings in gleaming restaurants and phone calls I could hear from the street because the patio doors were thin. My cousin laughed about how the estate would be split neatly, how the judge would see through grandson guilt. My aunt hosted a brunch and invited a reporter who told a story laced with half-truths and enough moral outrage to fill a church. They pooled money for experts like people set down wine at a party, experts in handwriting and memory, in the slow art of turning a life into a legal problem. They congratulated one another in group messages that read like war rooms, and their language was clinical: motions, affidavits, timelines. There was even a celebratory selfie with Morgan the bulldog grinning like a man who had already smelled victory. They were wrong in ways they could not see because their view was too narrow. Their overconfidence made them sloppy. A cousin who handled estate taxes left a draft file on a shared drive with the wrong permissions, and suddenly I saw an accounting that suggested more unpaid taxes on their projects than anyone realized. Another cousin bragged loudly on a recorded call about a plan to pressure the nurse who had been kind to my grandfather, not knowing the nurse had taped the conversation secretly after being harassed by a pie. Their hired people stumbled because they were new to the idea that a small town holds memory like currency and that people will remember kindness with the stubbornness of tide. The more they pushed, the more dirt they tripped over on their own shoes. There were moments when I felt like a man alone on a dock watching a storm that everyone claimed would break one way, while I knew the current ran the other. I slept little and dreamt of gears meshing together the way my grandfather used to explain the best defenses, tight machining inevitable. When a vandal smashed the shop window and left brass gears scattered like a vandalized life's remains, I did not rush to the cameras. I swept up the pieces, counting them like prayer beads. A few neighbors came in under the pretense of buying batteries and left wearing the armor of facts. I had been here, I had worked until dusk, I had been kind. Those small acts were less splashy than headlines but steadier than the angry tides. Their arrogance reached a peak when they publicly announced they were filing additional motions to freeze accounts, to force an inventory, as if freezing the river would stop the current. They spoke of me as if I were an object in their design, an irritant to remove. They underestimated the cost of exposure. Their filing required testimony, witnesses, sworn statements, and the more they wrote, the more threads they left for me to pull. It felt like watching someone set dynamite around themselves because they could not imagine a world where their meanness came back on them. I did not plant traps. My grandfather had planted them. I kept the sealed envelope in my drawer and the lawyer's coming voice in my head. I let them dig, believing in the slow arithmetic of justice and of a man's careful mind who had known how to read hands and had read his family's hands with an accuracy that now looked, from where I stood, like a map. The conference room smelled like recycled authority. A long table, leather chairs, a pitcher of water everyone pretended not to need, and a framed diploma that said law in a way that felt like a dare. I sat near the window and watched the light run across my hands, the ones that fixed gears and sealed envelopes, and across the faces of people who had come to reduce my life to ink and motive. Morgan, my family's hired gladiator, opened his mouth and gave us the performance he had been rehearsing. He spoke in the soft, confident rhythm of people who believe money buys time and truth and polite indignation. He painted me as a planner, a man who conveniently lived with an aging relative who isolated him, who cultivated dependence. He waved a stack of papers like a magician with a trick. He described timelines, convenient visits, odd transactions, the kind of narrative that looks seamless when you stitch the best sledding photos together and forget the freeze frames that don't fit. I felt the room tilt with each sentence. Friends of the family sat behind him, heads nodding with professional sympathy as if sympathy were a brand. The private investigator, a man with sunglasses and the soft edges of a paid stare, offered a few details that had been trimmed and sharpened for effect. I listened and tried to keep my face like my grandfather's clock, unmoved and honest. My own lawyer, calm and smaller than some of the papers stacked on the table, let Morgan finish his sermon. I could tell she was collecting the words he left in the air, like a person waiting to catch a thrown knife. When Morgan finally paused and gave us that smile the media trains, my lawyer folded her hands. She thanked him for setting the record so clearly. Her voice was quieter than his had been, but every word had the weight of metal. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "because you were so thorough, would you do us the courtesy of reading paragraph 7, section B of the will aloud for the record?" For a second he smirked like a man conceding a trivial request. Then he reached for the will with the sort of slow, practiced arrogance that people use when they assume paper will always bend the way they want it to. He read the sentence like a man reading the weather, factual, easily dismissed. When he hit the keywords, the room changed temperature. He read the clause aloud, emphasizing each legal term without meaning to emphasize the bitter little joke tucked inside it. Any person who directly or indirectly initiates legal proceedings to contest the will, funds litigation, communicates accusations of undue influence or incapacity to third parties, or makes public statements intended to impugn the settlor's testamentary intent shall forfeit all interests and entitlements under this instrument, and those interests shall be distributed to the Riverkeepers Collective and the Maritime Workers' Trust in equal shares. The settlor anticipated such contests and sought to punish those who would attack his intent. It was the silence after the words that landed like a bell. For weeks they had been building a narrative that my close relationship with my grandfather was proof of theft. Morgan's mouth had just turned their tool into a confession, and he did it under his own breath and on the record. I felt a thin laugh bubble up and keep itself inside my ribs. The pie shifted in his seat. Two of my cousins went pale as if a tide had just turned in them. They had proudly called reporters, gleefully posted innuendo, pooled funds, and hired Morgan to start a case. They had signed the documents and sent the emails and left the viral posts. Each action named in paragraph 7 was an action they had taken. My lawyer did not need to say much. She slid across the table a printout of the group chat where they had boasted about pressuring the nurse and planned the press release. She set down copies of the viral posts and the letters to the editor, and she produced the retainer agreement showing who had wired what money and when. Then she smiled, a small, strange grin that felt like a hand closing a lid. "You just read their suicide note aloud, Mr. Morgan," she said softly. "You have them on the record conceding they did exactly what paragraph 7 forbids. They have already triggered its operation by your own admission and by their actions." Morgan's face changed. For a laughable beat, he looked like a man realizing his watch had been set to the wrong time zone. He tried to recover, to argue semantics. This was a contest, not a petition. Their statements were rhetorical, not operative. My lawyer let him parry until the words were all into the record, then she turned up the heat. She asked him point by point whether each act he had just described, posting, funding, communicating accusations, was a thing his clients had done. On the record, he answered, it was all there like teeth marks in bread. I watched the expression on my cousins' faces collapse into something like vertigo. One of them snapped at Morgan, whispering for him to stop talking, to take it back, to recall some polite lie. Morgan's hand trembled on the pen for the first time I had seen. There was a long legal silence where they all calculated whether retreat was possible and what the cost would be. My grandfather's name felt heavy and warm in the room, like a remnant of a man who had known how to read hands and knew when to set a snare. Then came the shard of brilliance no one had predicted. My lawyer stood and pointed out a lesser-known line in the clause that said forfeiture would be automatic and immediate upon the acts themselves, without further adjudication, and that any counsel knowingly participating in procuring such acts may be subject to restitution of fees paid to be placed in trust for the charities. Morgan's smile cracked. He had advised them out loud. He had helped them commit the acts they thought justified. My lawyer was not gloating. She was merely letting the law do what it always does when someone steps into their own trap. For a second, I felt like laughing so hard my chest would split, because my grandfather had written this not as spite alone but as a surgical kindness. He had hated seeing his house become a stage for greed, and he had engineered a way to make their greed fund what they called nuisances. The depositions continued and the questions got meaner. My cousins tried to withdraw their posts, called friends to delete messages, begged Morgan to find some technicality that absolved them. But the record was a cold mirror. The judge would see the words, the wired retainer, the editor's letters, the pie's photos. The trap had been set not by me or my lawyer, but by the man who had known how to wind people up and let them fall into their own momentum. I sat back and felt tired and oddly full, like a clock wound too tight, finally letting the spring do what it had been built to do. The law is a blunt instrument until a careful mind takes a file and turns it into a knife. My grandfather had been careful. I was doing only what he had taught me: wait, watch, and let the gears mesh until the whole ugly machine collapsed on itself. There was a moment in the room where time stopped acting like something you could measure and started behaving like something that could judge you. Morgan, who had been smooth as the inside of a coin all morning, picked up the will and smiled with the sort of confidence that has carried men through many bad decisions. He began to read paragraph 7 like a man reading weather, the room leaning forward because that is what crowds do when they smell a conclusion. He had not expected the paragraph to be a grenade. He read the opening lines, the ordinary legalese that lulls people into thinking law is a boring thing, and then his voice hit the crux and stuttered like a gear slipping. As he said the words that made the air weirder, his tone thinned. Forfeiture, he read, shall be automatic and immediate upon the occurrence of any covered action, the man said, and then his mouth closed around the sentence that made him taste metal, and such forfeiture shall be executed by the trustee without further court order. It was as if the paper itself had teeth. His hands shook a little, the pen tapping nervously at the margin, which is the first sign a lawyer has realized he has weaponized himself. The pie leaned in as if close proximity would solve things. My cousins, who had been badges of confidence 20 minutes earlier, went pale and small, like people shrinking under a sudden, honest light. You could feel thoughts collapsing into one another at the table. The grandfather had not just written a clause, he had built a machine. My lawyer, who had been watching Morgan like a person watching a match catch air, let him flail through the rest of the paragraph while she arranged the real twist across from us. The words Morgan read meant more than punishment, they meant action. The trustee was not some sleepy man who waited for a judge. He was a bank account with orders that would flip the switch the second the complaint was filed. My throat tasted like pennies because that was the sound of the trap closing, and I had watched my family throw themselves over its teeth with glee. Morgan tried to clarify, to say it would take more, that the court would still have the final word. His voice pitched up and then got small. My lawyer pushed softly and asked him to acknowledge whether his clients had indeed posted accusations, retained counsel, and sent a copy of their complaint to the executor. He answered, and the words came out less like defense and more like confession. On the record, they had done exactly what paragraph 7 forbade. Their own legal strategy, their proud press releases, their screenshots praising the filing, all of it was now evidence of their undoing. One of my cousins made a sound that was almost a human plea. She asked if they could withdraw the complaint, could they recall the filings, could someone please stop the machinery. It was almost tender because she sounded tiny, the way people sound when they realize they've cooked a meal for the wrong house. But it was too late. There was a clause inside the clause stipulating that any attempt to retract or nullify an action would be treated as an additional act of contest and would accelerate forfeiture and treble restitution. That had been my grandfather's last little disgust with their kind of meanness. He didn't just punish the attempt to take, he punished the cowardly footwork around it. Then the strangest thing happened. My lawyer reached into a folder and slid across a bank statement stamped with a time and a transfer number. The trustee had been instructed to distribute immediately on confirmation of contest. The money was wired, the accounts debited, and the ledger showed routing to the Riverkeepers and the Maritime Trust. They had not just written a clause, they had created a fast lane that skipped courtroom traffic and moved money where his values pointed. The relatives looked like men whose boats had been cut loose from the dock. Panic made their eyes hard and fast. Their hands, which had been so eager to point, started to search for excuses and then to claw at the air for miracles. You have to understand the smallness of their world for the moment to be true. They had counted on the slow churn of court and gossip to erode my standing. They had never imagined a man who worked with his hands, who kept ledgers of grudges and friendships, would engineer something that used their pride against them and made their haste complicit. When the trustee, a salt-stained ex-union leader my grandfather had trusted, stood and said over a speakerphone that the transfers were complete, and the Maritime Trust had already initiated plans to bid on the warehouse my cousins had been so proud of, you could see every plan in the room disintegrate. The Riverkeepers had issued a statement promising a campaign to protect the waterfront and buy up development rights. Their confidence turned to ash while the room smelled unexpectedly like coal and wet iron. Relatives who had been loud enough to drown out a church keyboard were now whispering in ways that sounded like confession. One of them started to cry, not from sorrow but from the realization that they had handed over not just money but leverage and reputation to people they had mocked. Another tried to blame Morgan as if the lawyer had the power to unsay acts recorded in emails and posted on feeds, but the record is a mirror, and it only shows what people put in front of it. I sat there with my hands in my pockets and felt the old, small joy of a clockmaker watching gears finally meet. It was victory made of law and stubborn kindness, and it tasted like rain on hot metal. When all the noise had died down enough for my grandfather's phrase to come back to me like a tide, I found myself whispering it into my palms the way he once tapped my forehead and said it into my ear. "Don't worry," he had said, "I know who's who." The room that had wanted to fold me into nothing had collapsed under the thing he had left, and in the quiet aftermath there was a thin, sharp satisfaction. The trap had been set not in anger but in foresight, and while the relatives would remember their humiliation for a long time, I would remember the look on his face the night before he died, the one that meant everything had been planned and we were merely performing what he had seen coming. The phone rang like a bell that morning, and when I picked it up my lawyer's voice was all teeth and sunlight. "They're gone," she said, like a woman who has watched a slow burn become a bonfire and finally calls the cavalry. She walked me through confirmation numbers and account statements, each one a tidy proof that the trustee had executed the will's instructions without waiting for anybody's permission. The word she used was precise and oddly joyful: forfeiture confirmed. The relatives' complaint was rendered void by their own hands. Their claims evaporated because they had done exactly what the will said would trigger an end. For a second, I felt dizzy with the strangeness of victory that needed no shouting, only paper and timing and a man's careful malice toward greed. I drove to the shop almost on muscle memory, thinking about how my grandfather had loved his quiet victories. Morgan's face when he realized his own words had been the instrument of their disaster was a sight I had trouble erasing. The cousins were weathered in ways arrogance does not prepare you for. They had rushed to file, proud and loud and sure, and had essentially mailed the keys to the bank with a note that said please. Now the Riverkeepers and the Maritime Trust, the two groups they had always disparaged, were being wired sums that made people's heads turn. The Riverkeepers announced a plan within a week to buy up the last parcel of the waterfront and turn it into a public preserve and dock for local fishermen, not luxury condos. The Maritime Trust posted a list of scholarship recipients and community grants supporting dockworkers' children and training programs. Money moved with more kindness than I expected. What I remember most from those first days wasn't the clicking of keys or the glow of bank statements. It was how people reacted when they realized the money was going where it had always deserved to be. Neighbors who had taken my grandfather's side in secret came forward with stories, with small gifts and with laughter that helped stitch up the months of ugliness. The Riverkeepers named a small boathouse after my grandfather, a plaque engraved with a line about keeping time and tides. The Maritime Trust restored a rusted clock from his shop and placed it in their hall with a note about labor and dignity. My cousins' faces went from indignant to blank in the paper of a single press release, and then to something quieter and more real: the slow understanding that the world had judged them by their actions and found them wanting. People asked me if I felt revenge. They expected a kind of theatrical glee, but what I felt was mostly tired relief and a grain of something like sorrow. My grandfather had not signed that clause out of hatred for his family. He signed it because he'd watched them over decades and because he wanted his life's work to help the things he respected, not the people who polished their teeth for funerals and estate hearings. He had chosen the charities not to punish, but to honor what he loved: the river he sailed on, the workers he had argued with and stood with, the small, stubborn communities that kept life honest. That was the punchline and the mercy. He gave the last laugh not to himself but to the causes that would preserve what mattered. I took a small portion of what I inherited that was explicitly mine under the will, his pocket watch, the shop, the drawer key, and fixed the place that had always been a home for both of us. I reopened the clock shop with a sign that said repaired with respect and started an apprenticeship program for kids who wanted hands-on work, teaching them to read gears and to take pride in small things. I also helped the Riverkeepers and Maritime Trust in ways that felt right. I loaned them tools and my grandfather's ledger that listed folks who had helped him in storms. I refused to touch the large sums that had been diverted. I would not trade his last intention for any secret pleasure. The charities used the money to buy land, fund programs, and in the strangest and loveliest twist, purchase the old warehouse my cousins had earmarked for condos and turn it into a community workshop and gallery that celebrated the town's workers and craftspeople. The relatives tried technicalities at first, screamed about overreach and punitive intent, but the law had ironed itself flat around the will. Judges read the clause and saw the clear, premeditated architecture of a man who had known how lawyers think. Appeals were filed and spent, like men trying to catch their own shadows, and slowly their energy bled into silence. They lost together and separately. Public opinion, once fickle, began to settle into the truth that they had unmade their own inheritance with their greed. Some left town, some kept their houses, but none of them held the story in a way that would let them be proud of it again. Pride had been their undoing. On slow evenings, I would wind my grandfather's watch and listen to the small, honest tick he loved. People would come by and tell me the riverkeepers had stopped a slated development, or that the Maritime Trust had paid for a young apprentice's first set of tools. The town felt steadier, as if a crooked tooth had been set right. Once, standing at the shop door, I tapped my head like he used to and said under my breath the phrase that had sounded like a private benediction when I was a child. "Don't worry," I said into the dusk, and the echo answered like a tide. He had known how to read hands, and in the end he wrote a clause that read his family for him. His last laugh was not mean. It was precise, and it made the world better for the people who had loved the man, not the money.